The rain had begun hours ago, turning the streets of the city into glimmering mirrors that reflected the chaos of headlights and hurried footsteps. Inside the Bellamont Hotel, though, everything was still, serene, almost detached from the world outside. The clinking of cutlery against porcelain and the low hum of classical music filled the lobby cafe, where men in tailored suits discussed profits and women sipped their lattes with studied grace. At a table tucked in the far corner, Ethan Vale sat alone, his coffee untouched, his mind far from the polished room around him. The CEO of Vale Enterprises was a man whose presence used to command rooms, whose confidence once made competitors tremble. But that was before the accident, before the night his wife, Clara, had taken her last breath on a rain-slicked road. 2 years had passed since then, yet grief had become his constant companion, an invisible shadow that never left his side. He had built a fortress of silence around himself since her death. He rarely appeared in public, rarely smiled, rarely spoke beyond necessity. His board of directors tolerated his absence because his mind was still sharp, his decisions still made them richer. But Ethan knew what they whispered when he wasn't there, the widowed ghost. The man who built everything but lost himself. His assistant, Megan, had forced him out tonight, insisting that he needed to attend the company gala. "You can't keep hiding, Ethan," she'd said, her tone half pleading, half stern. "People are beginning to think you've given up." He hadn't given up, he just couldn't find the point in pretending that life still had color. He stirred the coffee slowly, watching the surface ripple. The dark reflection that stared back at him didn't look like the man Clara had married. His eyes had dulled, his jaw was tighter, the warmth gone. "Excuse me, sir, are you ready for your check?" The voice was soft, unassuming, yet it cut through his thoughts like light through fog. He looked up, and froze. The waitress standing before him had the kind of face that would be easy to overlook in a crowd, gentle, open, honest. But her eyes, those eyes, hit him like a punch to the chest. They were hazel with tiny flecks of green, framed by lashes that trembled slightly when she spoke. For a moment, Ethan's heart forgot how to beat. It was impossible, she looked just like Clara. Not an exact copy. Her hair was darker, her frame a bit slimmer, but the resemblance was enough to make the air around him feel suddenly too thin. He blinked, trying to steady himself. Sorry, what did you say?" "I was asking if you're ready for your check," she repeated, her lips curving into a polite smile. "You've been sitting here a while." Yes, of course," he murmured, fumbling slightly with his wallet. But his gaze didn't leave her face. "What's your name?" he asked before he could stop himself. She blinked, caught off guard. Lena Carter." "Lena," he echoed quietly, tasting the syllables as if they carried weight. She tilted her head slightly. "Do I know you?" He shook his head quickly. "No, you just remind me of someone." She smiled again, a touch of warmth softening her features. "Must have been someone important." He didn't trust himself to answer, so he simply nodded. She placed the check in front of him and turned to leave. He watched her go, each step stirring ghosts he thought he'd buried long ago. When she disappeared into the back room, he sat there motionless, his chest tight with something between pain and wonder. He should have left it alone. It was just a resemblance. Just a trick of grief. But the way she moved, the way her voice softened at the end of each sentence, it was like Clara had sent her, like life was giving him one fragile glimpse of something he'd lost forever. An hour later, Ethan found himself standing in front of the ballroom's tall glass doors. Inside, the company gala was in full swing, music, laughter, champagne, and smiles as artificial as the glittering chandeliers. He tugged at his cufflinks, feeling out of place among people who pretended not to see the cracks in his facade. He entered quietly, heads turned, conversations dipped. For a man who avoided the spotlight, Ethan Vale still drew it effortlessly. "Mr. Vale," a voice called from near the bar. It was Megan, his assistant, her eyes lighting up with relief. "You came. Thank God. The investors have been asking." "I won't stay long," he said curtly. "Just make an appearance," she pleaded. "Smile a little. You don't even have to talk much." He nodded absently, letting his gaze drift over the room. The same faces, the same forced laughter, the same emptiness. He felt suffocated. And then, Suddenly, he thought of her. The waitress with hazel eyes and a smile that felt alive. Before Megan could say another word, Ethan turned and walked away. Downstairs, the cafe was closing. Staff were wiping tables, stacking chairs, turning off lights. Lena stood behind the counter, rubbing at a coffee stain with a towel when she noticed him walking in again. Her brows furrowed slightly. "Mr. Vale, did you forget something?" He shook his head. "No, I came to ask you something." She raised an eyebrow, cautious but curious. "Ask me what?" He hesitated. He wasn't a man who fumbled for words, but this was different. "I have an event upstairs tonight. A company gala. I was wondering if you'd accompany me." Her mouth parted slightly. "You want me to what?" "To be my date," he said simply, though his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. Lena blinked at him, as if waiting for him to laugh and say it was a joke. "You're serious?" He nodded. "Yes, just for tonight. Just one evening." She gave a nervous laugh. "You realize how strange that sounds, right? A CEO asking a waitress he just met to be his date." "I do," he said, his tone steady, his gaze locked on hers. "But you remind me of someone. Someone I cared about very much." Something in his voice, raw and unguarded, made her heart stutter. "Look, Mr. Vale, I appreciate the offer, but I'm working." "I'll handle that," he interrupted gently. "You won't get in trouble. And I'll make sure you're compensated." She frowned. "It's not about money." "I know," he said, his voice softer now. "But please, just one night. I don't want to face it alone." Lena looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his eyes she couldn't refuse, a deep, weary sorrow that went beyond loneliness. Against her better judgment, she found herself nodding. "All right," she said quietly. "One night. An hour later, the entire ballroom seemed to turn its gaze toward the grand staircase as Ethan Vale descended with a woman at his side. Lena had changed into a simple black dress borrowed from the hotel's lost and found wardrobe for staff, yet she looked radiant. Her hair was loose now, soft curls brushing her shoulders, and the faintest touch of lipstick gave her the glow of quiet confidence. The crowd buzzed instantly. "Who's she? Is that his new girlfriend? She looks like Clara Vale." Ethan ignored every whisper. He offered his arm to Lena, who took it hesitantly, her eyes darting around the lavish room. "You're making people stare," she whispered. "Let them," he said simply. "For once, I don't care." At their table, investors tried to strike up polite conversation, but Ethan barely heard them. He was too aware of Lena beside him, her laughter soft and genuine, her presence grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. When she leaned over to ask about the painting hanging nearby, her curiosity so natural and unpretentious, he felt something stir deep inside him, a feeling he'd buried long ago. "You don't seem like someone who enjoys these parties," she observed. "I don't," he admitted. "I used to, once. My wife loved them." She hesitated. "What happened to her?" He swallowed hard, setting down his glass. "She died 2 years ago." "I'm sorry," she said quietly. He looked at her then, and for the first time in a long time, his expression softened. "So am I." They didn't speak for a while after that. The music changed, something slow and romantic, and couples drifted to the dance floor. Ethan stood and extended his hand toward her. "Dance with me," he said. She looked startled. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "Please," he said again, and there was something in his tone she couldn't resist. So she took his hand. They moved slowly across the floor, the world narrowing to just the two of them. He held her lightly, careful not to overstep, yet close enough to feel her warmth. His breath brushed against her temple, and for a moment, she felt his pain, the kind of ache that had no cure. As the song ended, she looked up at him and whispered, "You're still in love with her, aren't you?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. Later, they slipped out onto the terrace. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean under the glow of 1,000 lights. Lena leaned against the railing, wind teasing her hair. "You know," she said quietly, "I wasn't sure I should have said yes. But now I'm glad I did." He looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You are." She nodded. "You needed someone to remind you that you're still here." He gave a soft, almost broken laugh. And what about you? She smiled faintly. Maybe I needed to remember that sometimes it's okay to take a chance. They stood in silence for a while, watching the city breathe beneath them. Then, quietly, she said, when tonight ends, we'll both go back to our worlds. Yes, he said, though the word hurt more than he expected. But for tonight, she whispered, let's just be two people who found each other by accident. He turned toward her, eyes glistening. For tonight, he agreed. And for the first time in 2 years, Ethan Vale let himself feel something tender, fragile, painfully human. Something that might just change everything. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the tall windows of Ethan Vale's penthouse, touching the edges of his desk, the shelves lined with untouched books, and the half-empty glass of whiskey from the night before. He hadn't slept, not really. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, the way Lena had looked under the soft glow of the chandeliers, the quiet strength in her gaze, the way she'd said for tonight. He hadn't meant to bring her home. After the gala, he'd offered her a ride, and she'd accepted politely. But when the car pulled up to his building, neither of them wanted to say goodbye. So they'd gone up for a drink, just to talk, nothing more. And talk they did, until the moon gave way to dawn. Now, she was gone. A note sat on his counter, written in neat, looping handwriting. Greater than thank you for last night, Ethan. It was strange, but somehow beautiful. I hope you find what you've been missing. Lena. He read it 3 times before folding it carefully and slipping it into his jacket pocket. For the first time in 2 years, the silence in his penthouse didn't feel suffocating. It felt bittersweet. Lena's shift started at noon. She arrived at the cafe early, her mind still tangled with the memory of last night. It felt like a dream, how the richest man in the city had looked at her as if she mattered, how he'd listened when she spoke, how his loneliness had mirrored her own. But reality had returned swiftly when she'd woken before sunrise, realizing she was standing in a world that wasn't hers. A world of marble floors, quiet music, and the faint scent of expensive cologne on the air. So she'd left before he woke, choosing to slip away before she could start believing in something impossible. Morning, Lena called her coworker, Rita, as she stepped behind the counter. You look like you've been up all night. Lena smiled faintly. Maybe I have. Big date, Rita teased. Something like that, she murmured, glancing out toward the street where people hurried past, unaware that her entire world had shifted in one night. Days turned into weeks. Ethan returned to work, but something in him had changed. The board noticed it first. He was focused again, sharper, more present. He began showing up early, holding meetings in person, even smiling now and then. His assistant, Megan, didn't dare question what had caused the shift. She only saw that her boss was slowly coming back to life. But every night, when the city lights dimmed, Ethan found himself thinking about Lena. He told himself it was absurd. They came from 2 different worlds. She was a waitress, he was a CEO whose name appeared in magazines. Yet every logical argument crumbled when he remembered her laughter, or how she'd looked at him with empathy instead of pity. He visited the cafe once, just once, hoping to see her again. But she wasn't there. A different waitress told him Lena had taken a few days off. He left without leaving a message. He didn't know what he would have said anyway. 3 months passed. Winter settled over the city, bringing with it biting winds and the smell of snow. Ethan attended a charity dinner one evening, a formality he couldn't escape. Cameras flashed as he arrived, journalists whispering, the widowed CEO finally returns to the social scene. He smiled politely, shook hands, gave a short speech about resilience and rebuilding. But halfway through the evening, as he mingled near the buffet table, a familiar voice caught his attention. Excuse me, are these glasses for the wine or the sparkling water? Ethan turned. Lena stood there, wearing a modest black uniform, a silver name tag pinned neatly to her chest. She was part of the catering staff. For a moment, the noise around him vanished. Lena, he breathed. She froze, the glass in her hand trembling slightly. Mr. Vale. The formality in her voice stung him. I wasn't expecting to see you here, he said softly. Neither was I, she admitted, glancing nervously around. I needed extra shifts. Holidays are expensive. You could have called me, he said before he could stop himself. She gave a small, tired smile. We don't exactly live in the same world, remember? He took a step closer. You think that matters to me? It should, she whispered. A supervisor called her name from across the room, and she turned quickly, slipping away before he could say another word. Ethan stood there for a long time, the noise of the event fading into nothing. That brief exchange had left him with the unmistakable certainty that he couldn't let her drift out of his life again. The next day, he sent flowers to the cafe with a note. Greater than you said I should find what I've been missing. I think I already did. E.V. He didn't expect an answer. But that evening, as he was leaving his office, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Greater than you shouldn't do things like that. People will talk. He smiled. Lena. Greater than let them talk, he replied. I only care what you think. There was no answer for a long time. Then, finally, greater than coffee. Tomorrow. Same place. Same table. 10 a.m. The next morning, the world outside was dusted in snow. Ethan arrived early, nerves twisting in his chest like he was 20 again. When Lena walked in, bundled in a gray coat and red scarf, the whole cafe seemed to brighten. She slid into the seat across from him. You really showed up. I wasn't going to miss this, he said quietly. You look well. I'm surviving. She smiled faintly. You seem better too. He nodded. I am. You helped with that. Her brows lifted. Me, I just spent one night reminding you you're human. That's more than anyone's managed in years. Lena looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. Ethan, whatever happened that night, it was real, but it was temporary. You needed someone to pull you back from the edge, and maybe I did that. But you don't owe me anything. He leaned forward. I'm not here because I owe you. I'm here because I want to be. She sighed softly. You don't even know me. I'd like to, he said simply. That silence between them was heavier this time, full of things neither dared to name. Then, softly, she said, I'm not who you think I am. I'm not Clara. I know, he said, his voice breaking a little. And that's exactly why I want to see you again. Something shifted in her eyes, a mixture of surprise and vulnerability. What are you saying? I'm saying, he replied, that you reminded me what it feels like to be alive. I don't want that feeling to disappear again. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her breath catching. Ethan, she began, but words failed her. He reached across the table, gently taking her hand. No expectations, no promises, just coffee, conversation, life. She looked at his hand, then at his face, and finally nodded. Okay, but you're buying. He smiled for the first time in a long time, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. Deal. Weeks passed. Coffee became lunch. Lunch became walks in the park, quiet evenings at bookstores, dinners that stretched past midnight. Ethan learned that Lena lived alone in a small apartment near the edge of the city, that she'd once dreamed of being a writer but gave it up to care for her younger brother after their parents died. She learned that beneath Ethan's wealth was a man who still carried guilt. Guilt for not being in the car the night Clara died, guilt for surviving when she hadn't. They never rushed it. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. Just two broken people slowly learning how to breathe again. One evening, as snow began to fall outside the cafe where they'd first met, Ethan looked at her across the table and said quietly, you know, this was supposed to be one day. She smiled. I remember. Can you be my date for one day? That's what you said. And you said yes, against my better judgment. And now, she tilted her head, pretending to think. Now I suppose I'm still saying yes, just 2 more days than I planned. He laughed softly, and she reached across the table to brush a speck of snow from his sleeve. You look happier, she said. I am, he admitted. You brought the color back. She smiled. Then maybe that's enough. But he shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. It's more than enough. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the falling snow. Inside, the widowed CEO and the waitress who had reminded him of love sat in quiet contentment, not as a man haunted by his past or a woman uncertain of her place, but simply as two souls who had found each other in a world that had once seemed too big, too cold, too lonely. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was living in the shadow of what he'd lost. He was standing in the light of what he'd found. And when he reached across the table, lacing his fingers through hers, Lena didn't pull away. This time, neither of them needed to say just for tonight. Because both knew that what began as one borrowed evening had quietly become the beginning of something real, something worth staying for.